Hi, my name is Francesca Federico. I'm a soprano, and I'm here today with composer Douglas Knehans, who is going to be a part of our Martial Opera Art Song Concert Gala Extravaganza in October. And I'm here to chat with him a little bit about his life, his career, and all of those fun things. So, how are you doing, Douglas?
I'm well, thanks, Francesca. It's good to see you. Good to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time. So let's start, I suppose, at the beginning. Can you tell me a little bit about where you grew up and the role that music played in your early life?
Mm. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and didn't come from a musical family at all. So the kind of music I grew up with was very eclectic, everything from like Barbara Streisand to Bach
The
and
best.
everything. Um, so yeah, it was a lot of influences from a lot of different perspectives, Broadway things, Herb Alpert, that kind of
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
Really, really a broad spectrum of things. And then as I got older, and before I was involved in music making and certainly before composition, just listening to a lot of normal, pop music of the time, the Beatles, the Carpenters, that kind of stuff. Um, and then I started in serious music, pretty late. I was in my last year of high school when I started instrumental study. So that was challenging, but I made pretty rapid progress. And the following year, got into music school, um, and then worked very hard to. I had a little room to catch up on my instrumental technique, obviously, and then also took composition lessons as a kind of second major all
Mhm.
through my undergraduate degree. So I've really been composing pretty much since then.
Mm. And were you ever involved in making popular music? Like, were you ever in a band or anything before you
Yeah,
started?
no, no. I, my instrument's the flute, so
Ah,
uh, I was in, orchestras and chamber ensembles and things like that. But no, it was strictly for me, pretty strictly classical.
wow, cool. And so before you discovered composition and discovered classical music study, what did you want to be, or what did you think you might be when you grew up?
Uh, I was very interested in visual art, so I had for a period hoped to be a graphic designer.
No.
Uh, and there was something about it that I was attracted to, but then also I couldn't really draw, like figure draw. So I felt that as a limitation to entering that field. I since learned that it actually shouldn't be or isn't. Um, but for me at that time as a kid, I thought, oh, I felt very insecure that I couldn't do that, and I wanted to be like an artist. So um, I started looking around for other, I guess, expressive avenues, if I can put it that way, and uh, music kind of loomed large. So that's why I started music late because I was kind of searching,
Mm-hmm. And was there any particular song or album that you remember growing up that really had an impression on you and maybe even influenced how you move as a composer?
Oh well, like I said, the kinds of albums we had in my house were were really broad spectrum. So uh, I remember my parents, my dad subscribed to like a record club, and
Mm,
they would send these things every month. Uh,
cool.
that it was kind of almost like a Reader's Digest record club or something. It wasn't like
Sure.
a more serious one, but what they had are these kind of magazines with kind of cardboard covers that included a record in it.
Mm,
So it was kind of like a life history of Bach or Tchaikovsky or something, and then like a kind of a greatest hits of Bach, greatest hits of Tchaikovsky kind of records, and I I became pretty enamored of those, especially the Bach one,
Mm,
and uh, really, I think that probably had the most impact on me, especially because it had the D minor partita on it
hmm.
for solo violin of Bach. And as a kid, I couldn't fathom how you get all those sounds out of one instrument
Mm.
at a time.
Yeah.
So I became pretty fascinated just listening to that a lot. So that probably is my earliest memory of like classical.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I remember as a kid, I also did not grow up in a classical music household whatsoever, but my mom got me all these cassettes when back in the day when we had cassettes. And they were called like Tchaikovsky at tea time and like Brahms at bedtime, like for little kids. And it was this sort of same idea of like a Reader's Digest, like a greatest hits for different times of the day. And I just thought it was so like charming and wonderful to sort of soundtrack each part of your day with a different composer.
yeah, yeah. It's good. Well, what's odd is that those things, especially with young kids, I guess, like with us, I mean, they make an impact, and
Yeah,
they actually strangely kind of work. So,
totally. I know, we
I'm
remember them now.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
So what
weird.
made you start playing the flute?
Well, like I said, I started late. I didn't have 10 years of piano lessons or anything like that, behind me when I wanted to go into music school. I was looking for an instrument that I could make pretty fast progress
Hmm.
with. And I tried the clarinet a little bit. I stupidly tried the violin, which was a complete and utter uh, fiasco.
Yeah.
And
Not
then
easy.
not easy. Yeah, right. Wrong instrument.
Yeah.
Then I guess I happened on the flute and started getting lessons, and then I was lucky enough to. Well, I think what happened is that because I was a late starter, I felt like a special kind of urgency to make rapid, progress.
Yeah.
Uh, so I guess I'd been learning maybe a year and a half, maybe even just a year, and I called up the principal flute of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. We were living in Australia at the time.
Hmm.
So I just called him up and said, would you teach me? And uh, I guess that is not how it usually works or something, but he was a bit shocked, but said, yes, come and I'll have a listen. And so he was fantastic for me for a long period. And that allowed me enough progress to get into music school and so on. And so then I just started having, more serious lessons, not just in flute, obviously, right? Yeah.
Sure. That's such a gift. That's amazing. So yeah, let's segue into your experience in Australia as well, because I've learned from your bio that you studied in both Australia and the United States. What
Yeah.
was the experience like for you studying in Australia versus studying in the US, and sort of what did you gain from each experience?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's no doubt that higher education in music is somewhat a different flavor in Australia than here.
Mhm.
Uh, I guess especially in terms of how they teach musicology and theory in Australia.
Mhm.
Uh, it's more kind of integrated. The divisions between what is theory and
Mhm.
what is history
Mhm.
aren't quite clear. Uh, it's more kind of, I guess, uh, enfolded one into the other a little bit.
Yeah.
So the theory teaching that I had at that time was, I would say, not on a par with how we teach in the U.S. in terms of rigor.
Mhm.
Um, so I guess that's probably the chief difference I felt. But this is going back now. I'm pretty old. So this is going back like into the 1980s. So
Yeah.
it's very different now. So that I guess was the biggest difference. And also, I've since learned that my high school training was very good compared to what like my colleagues here went through in high school. So
Really?
um, yeah, we had very thorough music history training. So like in our last year of high school, we did a big survey of music, everything from Bird to Varese. We just
Wow.
went through it all.
Amazing.
Stravinsky, Berlioz, Beethoven, Bach, you name it, everything. Um, and then we also did in my last year of high school, we did a full stage production of Dido and Aeneas, and I sang in the choir and stuff.
Oh,
So
wow.
these were kind of very unusual
It is. Yeah,
experience
absolutely.
for a high school kid.
Hmm.
So I felt kind of advantaged that way. But then at the tertiary level, maybe less advantaged than kids are here.
Interesting.
Except that on the practical side of things, uh, it was very intense training. We had uh, a full, 1 hour lesson per week for the first 2 years of the degree, and then in the second 2 years, two 1 hour lessons per week with our main
Ah,
teacher.
okay.
Um, in addition to chamber music and symphony orchestra and playing for the opera and all of this stuff. So it was
Right.
fairly immersive, and I
Yeah.
got very into playing obviously a lot of new music. I was interested
Yeah.
in playing as well as writing
Hmm.
new pieces. So I learned a lot of extended techniques and all these sorts of things that people like doing, especially back then, uh, in in their music.
Were there any composers around that time when you were in your studies who really influenced sort of like how you conceive of what we call new music nowadays?
Uh, Yeah, mostly American composers. People like George Crumb.
Mm,
Uh, I remember playing a little piece of George Crumb's called 11 Echoes of Autumn, which is for alto, flute, clarinet, violin, and piano,
mm,
uh, and has his typical, circles and stuff and
hmm.
notation. And it was interesting to learn that with other students, and uh, did a piece of Thea Musgraves for
Mm.
soprano and flute. You may even know it, a piece called Primavera,
Yes,
uh,
yeah.
just for solo soprano and solo flute.
Yeah.
Um, and that was really interesting too, because we started getting these wolf tones, when the harmony was a certain type. And
Yeah.
uh, I found I had to change the timbre of the sound I was making in order to get rid of this strange wolf tone that was
Oh,
happening
yeah.
when we were in tune.
Wow.
So it was but it's a great piece, a really lovely little piece. Um, and there were a bunch of other new music pieces too. We did Aus den Sieben Tagen improv from the Stockhausen books,
Mhm.
and a lot of other new American music. Yeah.
Very interesting. I always wonder about these the differences between American classical music school techniques versus other countries. This was something that I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis on because I did not study music as an undergraduate. I studied global politics, but we all had to write a thesis. And I wanted to write mine on music. And so I did it about the difference in classical music education in New York, Paris, and Tokyo, and I was able to spend time in those places to sort of see the differences. But I would say, in terms of what you were saying in Australia, I had a similar experience studying at a conservatory in Paris because I took sort of what they told me was music theory and music history. And the music theory class was called uh, score study, I guess. And then the history class was called like Baroque performance practice. And it was all just sort of like a melange of everything. And like people were sort of shouting out like bits and bobs of like history and theory and like oral comprehension as I was going through. And I just found it all very like, it was very strict in a lot of ways. It wasn't really like discursory or whatever. You couldn't really discuss with your teacher in the same way that you would in the States. But it was also like extremely sort of just flowed between these different subjects at all times. And I wondered when I came out of it, like what it really was. But it weirdly did prepare me for a master's degree in music because I came in thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be so behind. Like, I haven't done my degree in music. Like, and then they put me in all of the highest theory classes just because I was the only singer in my, conservatory classes in Paris. So, they were operating on, I think, a higher level than what a lot of like classical singers experience in their undergraduate years. And it's just interesting seeing sort of what you absorb during those times, even when it seems slightly like less rigidly, prescribed like they kind of do in the States.
Yes, I mean, I think the main difference I think with American education is it's very focused on technique.
Yeah.
Whether it's in how you look at theory, or how you even how you report history. you know,
Mhm.
all of these things are very kind of boiled down to technical practice, and certainly with performance too. It's very about,
Yeah.
let's get your technical stuff sorted out first,
Yes.
and have a good foundation before we even kind of almost before we even start talking about music a little bit. Um,
Yeah.
and I think one thing I like about maybe Europe and Australia is that the the music is more centrally a driver, I guess, at especially the undergraduate level.
Mhm.
Um, and the technical things hang off of the music as a driver,
Mm.
um, rather than the music kind of hanging off the technique. Um,
That's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, definitely.
um,
I mean, I think this is a great segue. So I was reading this quote about you that said, Douglas Knehans' music is about complex relationships that are dramatically established and drawn over large time frames through a technique he calls deep line. Can you talk about this technique that you call deep line?
yeah, it's well, let me give a little background first to my background.
Please.
Composers of my age were all trained in serial technique. We never learned
Yeah.
anything else, but that
Yeah.
was composition. And so when I left music school, uh, the first thing I wanted to write was a set of songs to poems of Sylvia Plath, and this technique just wasn't cutting it for me and what I wanted to do with these songs.
Mhm.
So I found I had to start learning other techniques and other perhaps more traditional techniques. And so I was starting to look back again at Mozart and Bach and Beethoven, Tchaikovsky and Mahler and all these folks
Yeah.
to pretty much teach me
Yeah.
how a motive works, how a phrase works, how cadence works, I
Yeah.
mean, I knew theoretically how cadence works, but
Mhm.
that's different to putting it in practice with how you're shaping something, right?
Yeah.
So always for me, it's been this strange balancing act between a kind of quite edgy modernism and a kind of almost cryptotonal uh,
Yeah.
um, uh, technique that I learned through studying other composers of the past. So
Mhm.
um, this deep line technique is really about simply marrying the foreground idea with a background structure. So if you have like a foreground idea that does something like C sharp, F sharp, G, in a little melodic fragment,
Mhm.
um, I probably would project that against the overall structure of like a three movement piece, so that they were based on C sharp, F sharp, G,
Mhm.
as kind of tonal centers,
Mhm.
and then of course do that in a much more elaborate way than that little example. But that's basically the idea, to kind of, if you can imagine it, to take a fragment of the foreground and project it large against
Right.
the background as a kind of a structural tool. And I think it creates a kind of um, an organic kind of depth to the music that I really like, and that may not necessarily be able to be heard, but I think certainly is felt.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, this makes a lot of sense, I guess, for me as a layman in terms of understanding composition. It's like this idea of having the kernel of the idea, like the acorn, but it has these deep roots that branch out to each movement of the piece. So you can always kind of refer back to this tonal center that you've
Right.
established at the onset. Is that sort of what it?
That's
Okay.
almost exactly it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
And
Wow.
I found that, I've been using this technique for about maybe 15 years now. And I find that especially in long work, like like opera or symphonies or concertos, that it's really, really useful in keeping a focus, especially harmonic focus on the
Mm-hmm.
piece.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess I keep thinking about this phrase of like, you need to learn the rule before you can break the rule. So you going back into all of these old classical composers and figuring out exactly what this like sort of formal structure is, so you can be the one to kind of warp and expand on that in your own music is, I mean,
Well,
it's
I
a
think
fascinating idea. It's how we like continue this genre, right?
yeah, I mean, I think the thing, Francesca, was that with the serial technique, at least the way I was taught it, uh, it was pretty much exclusively foreground. Like there was nothing you like, say, if you're writing tonal music,
Hmm.
okay, a piece is in C major, but you stay in C major, you modulate, and you go to these related keys and so on. There, there was nothing quite like that. I mean, of course, there's transposition, but it was never kind of in any kind of structured way. It was always smaller pieces, um, always very foreground oriented. And for me, at that stage, I was only an undergraduate, so maybe there are other more sophisticated ways that people use serial technique, if anyone still is using it at all. But for me, at that point, it was insufficient to what I wanted to do expressively, I guess.
Sure. Understood. Interesting. So let's talk about your opera, Backwards from Winter. Um, when did you begin writing this and what inspired you to write it?
Well, I wanted to write an opera, and so it's a funny backstory. So I needed a librettist, and I got on LinkedIn and started just
Wow.
talking about it. And strangely, this writer from Maryland we started having like a very tentative text, messages through
Mhm.
LinkedIn back and forth. Uh, Initially, the piece was going to be about death poetry. I was going to have like a number of characters um, talk about their life, and each, end with a kind of Japanese death poem,
Mhm.
um, which range from tragic to philosophical to funny. I mean, it's
Oh,
really
wow.
it's an incredible body of literature.
Mhm.
So that was my initial plan. But then as we got talking, uh, Juanita, my librettist, had slightly different ideas, and we batted it back and forth, and it finally came out to be just really a simple love story told literally backwards. So um, the opera opens with the main woman mourning the death of her beloved. Then the second scene is um, his death, where he dies in a car accident.
Mhm.
Um, and then the third scene is uh, summer, where their love is kind of in full bloom and very uh, physical, and I won't say erotic because there's none of that in the opera, but
Hmm.
it has that sensuality about it,
Yeah.
of the sensuality of summer, I guess.
Yes.
Uh, and then finally in spring with the very blossoming of their love relationship. So it goes from kind of tragic to brighter um, by telling it backwards, I guess. Mm.
That's amazing. What, I mean, wow. There are so many. potential messages that one could take away from watching this piece, what is a message that you would say you were trying to convey when you were writing it?
Mm. Well, I think that love is all that matters, I think, is one really central message. Um, but then B, I guess, within that, life takes a toll,
Yeah,
So I think those are probably the two main messages that
yeah.
um, there is there's sometimes horrible tragedy in life, but when there's when there's love, and if there can be love, it's really got a redemptive force that is unmatched by anything, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very beautiful. Well, I'm very excited to sing a small excerpt from this piece. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
I'm
I've
really
been
excited
watching.
about it too.
Me too.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've
yeah,
been watching the videos on your website, and I mean, visually, it's also just really stunning, um, very haunting, and minimalist, but really creates a whole environment around the singer and the story.
yes. Well, that was kind of the plan. The plan was to write something that was quite immersive,
Hmm.
uh, but wouldn't need a budget like the Ring Cycle to to put on.
Sure.
Um, so the idea was to pretty much have everything be electronic. So have the basic score be all electronic and pre-recorded.
Hmm.
Uh, there's one live instrumentalist, an electric cellist,
Yeah.
and then the singer. So really only two musicians,
Mhm.
the whole thing,
Yeah.
uh, and then have a bunch of video too, so that it would be portable, uh, not dauntingly expensive to do,
Right.
uh, not a huge cast that had to be paid for and all of that. So um, that was the idea behind it, and I'm I'm really proud that it's had two productions so far, and I hope for more.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Other than Backwards from Winter, are there any other pieces that you're currently working on that you'd want to talk about?
Well, I'm searching for a new opera subject right now, and that's because of rights, that's hit a wall on
Sure.
a couple of good projects that would have been really great, and
Yeah.
can't get the rights. So I'm trying to rethink that, but certainly there's another opera brewing in there in me.
Mhm.
Um, and then apart from that, I've got for a piano trio for the Lincoln Trio in.
Great.
Um, that's what's next up on the agenda. Yeah.
Amazing. Wow, very cool. Well, I think that is all I have, but I'm really honored and thankful that you took the time to chat with me about all these things. And um, yeah, again, I'm just really excited to dive into Backwards from Winter and um, hopefully, perform it in the way that you have envisioned for your wonderful work that you've created.
Thanks, Francesca. I really look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.